Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Carpe, and I'm the president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and it is my delight and my honor to welcome you to the first ever George Jonas Freedom Award dinner. There are so many people to thank that have done so much in recent months, and inevitably I'm not going to be able to mention everybody, but there are a few in particular that I'm very grateful for. And first of all, I would like to thank for her support and encouragement and advice. I'd like to thank Maya Jonas for and I'd like to thank Sherry Naylor, who I believe could not be with us this evening, for the delightful photo loop, which will resume as soon as we start eating. Beautiful photo loop with 50 pictures from George Jonas's life, and so I'd like to thank Sherry Naylor for that. And special thanks to our sponsors. First of all, the National Post. Glad to have you here tonight with us. And Mr. Alex Daviduke. And Dr. Roy Epen, who I'll be introducing more later on, who will be doing the toast to the Queen. And Mr. Alan Gold. And last, but certainly not least, Mr. Robert Lantos. Most of all, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight, for taking time out of your busy schedules. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm now going to turn matters over to Bruce Hulser. Bruce Hulser is the chairman of the board of directors of the Justice Center. He is a managing partner of the law firm Crease Harmon in Victoria, and very pleased that Bruce would come all the way from Victoria to be with us this evening. Please welcome Bruce Hulser.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. What an exciting night for the Justice Center. As this new initiative is launched, my law practice is strictly commercial practice, and it is so important that we have people like John Carpe and the people on his staff that are getting in the trenches and defending our constitutional liberties. People who don't believe in freedom of speech and don't believe in our fundamental freedoms have had a pretty good run for 30 years in this country without anybody standing up to them. And events like this are so important to support John and his team, because we need to fight. We saw that today at the Supreme Court of Canada. We see that in courts every day. And I'm so pleased that in that struggle, we are joined by a number of luminaries who I'd like to introduce at our head table. First of all, we have Dr. Stefania Szabo, the Consul General for Hungary. And at our head table, we have our guest of honor, guest speaker, Mark Steyn, who will be receiving our award tonight. Lord Conrad Black and Lady Barbara Black, we're very pleased to have. Andrew Lawton and his wife Jennifer Beeman, who assist Mark Steyn with his Canadian endeavors, I understand. And we're very grateful for that. And we also have Doug Pepper, who's published many of the good works that both of these gentlemen have written. So thank you. Can you introduce Okay. I thought John had introduced Maya Jonas, but I'll just mention again how grateful we are that Maya Jonas was not only involved and supported this effort, but is here tonight with us. So thank you, Maya Jonas. And since I'm the only thing standing between you and your food, I'm going to leave the stage now. And you can enjoy the slideshow back on as your dinner is served.
When it comes to defending freedom, we live in very challenging times. Superficially, many things appear to be going very, very well. When you think of our technology, our economic prosperity, our high standard of living, so many things are going well. And yet at the same time, in the midst of this economic prosperity and technological sophistication and high quality of life in many material ways, we see some very aggressive and sustained assaults on our fundamental freedoms. Sad example, just today, Supreme Court of Canada ruled 7-2 to trample into the ground the fundamental freedoms of Trinity Western University and its students, its staff, its alumni. Very sad day. I will remember June 15th, 2018 as a significant step backwards for the Free Society by virtue of this decision, the ramifications of which I'm not even going to start on it, are very, very negative, very dangerous decision for the Free Society. So the purpose of the Justice Centre is to be a voice for freedom in Canada's courtrooms. We want to fight these battles. We lose some of them. We were interveners in the Trinity Western cases in BC, Ontario, Nova Scotia in the lower courts. And this is a loss for us as well as a loss for all of Canada. We also win some cases. We are supported by over 4,000 donors across Canada who make possible our work. We're growing rapidly. I have 3 full-time staff lawyers. I have a full-time paralegal, another part-time lawyer, another lawyer joining us in September. And so we've got this team of litigators that is fighting battles all across Canada. And obviously not enough time tonight to go into all of them, but I will talk about just one recent, and we'll have a short video in a minute about this. Foster parents in Hamilton, Derek and Frances Bars, and they went through the process with the Hamilton Children's Aid Society, all the hoops and hurdles and forms and so on, and got approved, and were given in their care 2 lovely young girls, 3 and 4 years old, who had been through a lot, separated from their biological parents with the goal and the hope that they would be reunited with the biological parents. The Bars had told the Hamilton Children's Aid Society beforehand. They had said that they were Christians and they did not celebrate Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or Halloween, and the Children's Aid Society said they were fine with that. And yet, after the girls were put in their care, they were reprimanded for not having taken the girls to get a photo with Santa at the shopping mall. And the social worker started pressuring them that as Easter was approaching, it was incumbent on this couple that they proactively tell the 2 young girls in their care that the Easter Bunny is real. And the couple, they tried to be flexible, and they said, well, we're not going to say that the Easter Bunny is false, but we believe it would be lying to the children to say that the Easter Bunny is real. We're not going to do that. We're going to have a chocolate Easter egg hunt, but we will tell the kids that it was us who hid the Easter eggs, and the social worker was adamant that this is not good enough. And now, if this had just been a rogue social worker, it's one thing, but she had the full backing of all of her supervisors and the agency, and they actually, the couple even offered to, that the girls would spend Easter weekend somewhere else, and the social services said, no, and we're shutting down your home entirely. They took the girls away on 24 hours notice, which is, to be moved is already damaging, and then on 24 hours notice, took the girls away, shut down their foster home, and said, well, can we be foster parents even for infants? Right? Infants are not going to care about the Easter Bunny or Santa or Halloween. No, shutting down your foster home entirely. Fortunately, these people had the courage to come forward and to be clients in a court action because we wanted to make a difference and create a precedent on this front. So I'm going to ask the audiovisual people if they could play the short video right now on one of our court cases.
Come on, girls, it's time to go. Girls? Hey, oh, you look so beautiful. Yeah, let's get your sweater on. Perfect.
Can we go show Dad?
Yeah, go show Daddy. Go on.
Very beautiful. What do you think? Did Mama do a good job picking out Easter dresses?
Yeah.
Okay. Go wait for us. We'll be right there.
My favorite colors. And then blue's my second and green my fourth.
How are the girls?
They're good. And they're happy, just happy kids,
Easter's right around the corner. Are they excited?
I can't do this.
What?
This. Pretending like this is a normal checkup. I can't lie to them.
It's not lying. Okay, it's tradition. Everybody does it. To be honest, it's a little troubling that we're still having this conversation. I feel like you've disregarded every conversation that we've had so far. It's important that this is part of our program, okay? There's research. When families participate in these cultural rituals, that there's a lot more engagement. Are you gonna get that? Are you gonna get that?
What?
The pot. It's boiling.
So just let me get this straight. If I don't teach my girls that some giant 6-foot-tall egg-laying magical rabbit is real, you're going to take them away from me.
That's what parents do. They tell their kids the Easter Bunny is real.
No, parents love their children. They give them a safe and happy upbringing. They don't lie to them.
Maybe real parents do that, but foster parents teach their kids the Easter Bunny is real, or they don't get to be foster parents.
So this is an example of the work that the Justice Centre is doing across Canada. We have cases from BC to Nova Scotia, and you can find them all on our website, www.jccf.ca. I'm very pleased that we won this case. We've created a good precedent. As I was saying right before the movie played, our honored guest tonight, Mark Steyn, argues brilliantly that law follows politics, and politics follows culture. And so I'm so thankful for Mark for the good work that he does in fighting these cultural battles. The legal battles are also part of the picture, and that is the niche that we try to fill with the Justice Center. Now, I said earlier that June 15th, 2018, I will remember as a very bad day for Canada as a free society by virtue of this horrific and terrible Supreme Court of Canada ruling that was released today. However, June 15th is also a date that represents hope for at least two reasons. It was the birthday of George Jonas, June 15th. June 15th, 803 years ago, was also the date when Magna Carta was sealed. And so, the bigger battles in history are won by those who persevere. That's often the case, if not always the case. And so, certainly we are in dark times. Things might get a little bit worse before they get better. But we have our terrible June 15th in 2018, but we had the wonderful June 15th in 1935 when George Jonas was born, and a wonderful June 15th in 1215 when Magna Carta was sealed. And so in that spirit, we're going to keep on fighting these battles. I know that many of you are already supporters of the Justice Center, and if you're interested in supporting our work, you're welcome to do so. I've been asked many times in the last few months, is this a fundraising dinner? And the answer is no, it's not. The ticket price has been put at a way to allow as many people as possible to attend. With a speaker like Mark Steyn, we could have charged, twice or three times the amount, and we would have had an equally strong turnout tonight because we have such a fantastic speaker. But this is it's not a fundraising dinner, it's a break-even dinner. So, I'm glad that there are so many people here tonight, including a lot of people who admire George Jonas but never had the wonderful privilege and opportunity of meeting him. It is now my honor to introduce Conrad Black. So much could be said. I could spend the whole evening talking about his achievements and accomplishments, and much of it is a matter of public record. So I'm going to make this personal and say that I'm deeply honored to introduce Lord Black, and I have tremendous admiration for him for many reasons, and I'll mention just two. His historical knowledge is astounding, and my jaw drops every Saturday morning when I read his column, and that impressive, not a broad and deep grasp of history is just amazing. And so I admire that very much. Even more so is how he has handled his difficulties and trials and ordeals over the years, and kept on writing his columns when he was in a place where he did not want to be, and to maintain that positive attitude during all that time, and even to turn that dark situation around and to be teaching, helping other people in that prison and teaching them to read and write and helping them. I think it's amazing and tremendous. And so I'm deeply honored that Lord Black is with us tonight. You are a great Canadian, and we admire you, we appreciate you, and thank you for being with us tonight. Please welcome Lord Conrad Black.
Thank you very much, John. My dear friends, the honor is mine. Indeed, after such an elaborate analysis of the status of the Easter Bunny, the introduction of any less distinguished a man than Mark Steyn would be an anticlimax. And thank you for your very gracious words, generous words, John. We all play the cards we're dealt, and sometimes they're not a good hand. Mark is, of course, well known to all of you and a very justly renowned figure. And you might not know that he was actually born in Toronto, but he is one of the few people who was born in Toronto, went to school largely in Birmingham, England, and then launched his career, his media career, in Timmins, Ontario. An odd trajectory and a mere prelude to what was to come. But being in Timmins as a disc jockey, he was, in a sense, following in the great tradition founded by Roy Thompson and Jack Kent Cooke, who, when they kept the files of the Timmins press in a bathtub in Timmins in the early 1940s, would have been improbable candidates to spend the declining decades of their lives as billionaires, which they did do. So, Mark, the best is yet to come. I first became aware of Mark when he started writing for a newspaper when I was the chairman of the Daily Telegraph in London, The Independent, which practically nobody read, including me. But our editor at The Spectator, Dominic Lawson, a brilliant editor, spotted him and attracted him to The Spectator, where I did see him, and insisted that he be engaged by the Daily Telegraph. And we were an expanding newspaper company at that time when the industry was flourishing. And as our editors in different places got a look at him, they all wanted him. And before long, he was being published in Jerusalem, Sydney and Melbourne, Australia, Ottawa and Calgary, Vancouver, and when we founded at the National Post in Chicago, when we bought the Sun-Times, the sun never set on Mark's readership. But he had a delightful man and dear friend as he is. I cannot say that he is the easiest employee I've ever dealt with. And he had two practices that created, well, three that created certain problems. One was he would only deal on an issue with the company, no matter how obscure it was. He would only deal with my associate Dan Colson and myself, one or either one of us. And secondly, he was almost impossible to reach because this was in the era when he informed me that he was buying a winter house in Iraq and a summer house in Tadoussac. And I don't think he actually did it, but he, as the English would say, po-facedly told me that's what he was going to do. But he, as far as I could establish, lived in a recreational vehicle, which looked like a modified Sheridan tank on wheels that he constantly had in motion between Vermont and the region of Montreal, just outside Montreal. And mobile phones were not then what they are now. So he wasn't so easy to get hold of. And the third problem was that his view was that he had an agreement with the company. So if any editor from Jerusalem to Sydney, going in either direction, altered so much as a comma, it was down pens. It was the old Fleet Street rules. That was it, nothing. And we would get a cascade of urgent inquiries from editors all over the world saying, where's Mark's column? We're holding the space for him. And then Dan Colson or I would have to chase him up, which, as I said, was complicated. And we could always resolve it. He's a perfectly reasonable man to deal with, but he has his foibles, and they're lovable, but they can be difficult. He of course, he became a writer that everybody became addicted to, and I thought that his reporting on President Clinton and his travails were particularly brilliant, and I thought his summary at the end of the spurious impeachment trial that president was subjected to in the U.S. Senate, when it ended, no one summed it up as well as Mark did when he wrote, "Air Force One is back in its hangar." When the American legal system inflicted itself upon me, which John graciously referred to, Mark had the task of reporting on this for Maclean's and blogging on it every day. And he became, given the genius of his insight and the brilliance of his exposition, an influence in the case, because he would encounter jurors. Now, these jurors were a pretty un-Solomonic group, and they were part of the catchment of the great city of Chicago, which at the best of times is a pretty rough town. And he would happen into conversation with them and extract the most astounding things from them, which was good intelligence for us. But he took to writing about them individually in his blog, and he particularly focused on one lady. That's a very all-encompassing use of the word lady, who had the habit of, if you remember that pink bubble gum where you could blow big bubbles with, and she'd blow these big bubbles out, sitting immediately in front of the jurors or the prosecutors. And Mark described how this woman had an astounding talent for producing these gigantic chewing gum bubbles that hovered over the prosecution like German airships in World War I. Anyway, one fine day, there was no more blowing of bubbles. Obviously, Her Honor the Judge, now on her way to the Circuit Court of Appeals, by the way, was reading the blog. But Mark and I, when Barbara and my daughter Alana we were together there, and they flagged a bit. They didn't always want to go out to dinner, but Mark and I did, and we had some most entertaining dinners in Chicago. But I have always felt, and I must tell you this, Mark, I think you have, and it's very rare for you, a slight degree of envy because while we had our joint table in a couple of restaurants, including the one that I subsequently discovered was favored by the then senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, though we never saw him there, I think you were slightly envious of the fact that at Le Tout Paris, I got on the menu and you didn't. So, you don't win them all. I don't want to finish without saying a serious word about the tremendous stance of principle that Mark has taken in some of the litigation that he's had to deal with. In the case of Michael Mann, he commented on this monstrous charlatan and all that rubbish about the hockey stick, and at least when the Prince of Wales said that Manhattan would be underwater and we'd all be, the temperature in Winnipeg in February would be 90 degrees Fahrenheit if we didn't all live under thatch and ride in carpools. He was sincere, but this man was just a disgrace, and Mark commented on that and has been tangled up in the horrors of the civil legal system in the U.S. Since then. the battle that he had with these fascistic human rights tribunals, which is the classic Orwellian newspeak. It means the deprivation of people's rights. And like the Trinity Western case, this absolute scandalous decision, though not unfortunately a surprising one today that John referred to. Mark fought the good fight there and he won. And he, of course, this absolute scoundrel, Mr. Katz, with whom he was briefly in business, and that in that bust-up, Mark won. And this must be the greatest act of accidental justice produced by the American legal system in decades. But he won an award of $4 million. And the last I saw, Mark's opponent was conducting a fraudulent bankruptcy to try and deprive Mark of his winnings. Anyway, the introduction of Mark, again, could go on at great length, but you haven't come here to listen to me, so I shall subside. I'll only say that I understand I can't actually leave the stage. We are going to show that Metternich was right, that all things end either by the people on the stage finishing or those that they're trying to deal with mounting the stage. But I think in this case it'll be a benign matter of giving Mark his award, and it is a very great honor and a very great pleasure to be part of honoring George Jonas, specifically with Mark Steyn, two great men and dear friends. Thank you.
So thank you. And special thank you to Conrad. Every year, June 15, I ask Conrad to make a speech, related to George. So thank you, Conrad. And Mark, I know that George held you in the highest esteem as a person and as a fellow writer. And I know that you, for sure, would have been his first choice. So here you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. It is a great honor to be here. Thank you to Conrad. It's great to see so many old friends from the launch of the National Post, Conrad and Barbara, and I think my old editor, Natasha, is, where are you, Natasha? Oh, over there. And I think was Andrew Coyne in the room, or has he fled in terror after hearing Conrad's encomium to me? In your dreams, Andrew. It's great to be here. George was a big part of the early days of the National Post. He was a most unusual columnist in that he had another life. He wasn't interested in whether Patrick Brown was up and John Tory was down. Jonathan Kay, no disrespect to Jonathan's mother, who's here, but one of the few things Jonathan has got right in recent years was when he said that George was at his least useful to the paper in the 6 weeks before an election, because he didn't have much of an interest in the passings and goings of ordinary politicians who all let you down. And he had a much richer hinterland. He said interesting sentences that nobody else has written, as far as I can tell from a Google search. His father was, my father knew the names of librettists, was a sentence that George wrote. And I always like, nobody else, you can read Andrew Coyne for the next 30 years, he'll never do that. George wrote libretti, he wrote poetry, he wrote plays, he wrote novels, he wrote true crime, in part because I think the forensic aspect of true crime required the same precision as writing a poem or a libretto, where you've got to say it in you've got to be very precise, you've got to get your syllables lined up, you've got to get your prose. He was a dramaturge. I think this was one of his first jobs at a provincial theatre in Hungary, which was putting on an operetta festival. And I'd spent some months in Hungary making a film on operetta with MTV, which isn't the caterwauling rock video station of the 80s, but is in fact stands for Magyar Televízió, I think, Hungarian television. And so I was interested in operetta, and he told me when he put on this operetta festival that they'd had a lot of the old operettas, the Merry Widow, the Count of Luxembourg, the Countess Maritza, the Count of this, the Count of that, the Lord Black of Cross Harbour. That's a fantastic operetta. He gets the girl in the end. You'll enjoy it. So they had all the, but because it was under communism, the operetta was problematic because of the class elements of this. So they said at one point, the local commissar says, "Oh, what about the Soviet operetta?" And George says, "What do you mean Soviet operetta?" And the guy says, "Well, you know, the Soviets would be offended if you have an operetta festival and you don't have a Soviet operetta." They couldn't find a Soviet operetta. So George and a couple of pals wrote one themselves, and it's called Little Sunshine. And as Soviet operettas go, it's quite competitive because after the Merry Widow and the Count of Luxembourg and all that, there was a big downturn in basically communism kills operetta because they kill all the counts. So what are you going to sing about? So they had the big socialist operetta in Hungary was an operetta called The State Department Store. And if there's any Hollywood, I don't know whether there are any of our Hungarians in that. Did you ever see that ad? It was a big thing. They used to show the State Department Store. If you're a Hollywood producer, you know that's a hit title. George was unlike any other columnist at the National Post. He had a rich life. And he could have had a happy and productive life just writing poetry and libretti and so on, if it weren't for the fact that he also cared about what was happening to the country he came to accidentally and to Western civilization in the broader sense. And so he devoted part of his life to speaking up about the great threat to liberty all around us, as we saw in the Supreme. By the way, since this is a night dedicated to the Easter Bunny, I want to say that I believe in the Easter Bunny far more than I believe in the Supreme Court of Canada. And actually, if they want to appeal it to the Easter Bunny, the Trinity Western, I'm all for that. They should do that. George was a great writer. Everybody knows that George was not in great physical shape toward the end, and he spoke for the Justice Centre just a couple of years before he died. And if any of you were there, you'll know, well, when I say he spoke, he couldn't actually speak his own speech at that point because he was too physically ill to stand up or whatever. So he sat down and somebody else read out the speech for him. And it was the coolest thing I've ever seen because George just sat there while some other guy read out his speech, and George sat there laughing at his own jokes. It was a fantastic thing. So tonight I've decided, can you bring a chair up? I'm going to take the chair, and Andrew Coyne's going to come and read my speech. So, yeah, that's good. No, take that way. That looks like Clint Eastwood. I can't match Clint's cool. You know, I don't like teaching writing, because if you've got anybody, if there's a worse thing in the world than going and taking a course in writing or going to journalism school, I don't know what it is. Columbia Journalism School, people mortgage their homes, they stack up $400,000 of debt to go and work in an industry that's currently paying $28,000 a year. I mean, that really is a sensible business model. And so I used to, but I've occasionally been asked to teach writing and column writing, and I used to use George as an example, because I said George always had ingredients that you want. You never want a column to just live in the present tense. You also want something that looks backwards and looks forward, that uses the past to say something about the future. And George was actually brilliant at that. He had a great way of just selecting some poignant little vignette from thousands of miles away and hundreds of years ago that would illuminate the point he was wanting to make. He was also a great aphorist. And I find, I don't know about you, but it's like, I find when you're writing, it's, generally speaking, it's easy to steal some other fellow's insight because most of the time it's not quite as well expressed as it should be. You know, the words don't get the full juice out of the thought. I often, with Andrew, for example, I'm reading him and he'll like stumble on something that I think, oh, that's quite good, but it doesn't quite have the like laser-like precision that, you know, a really gifted wordsmith might bring to it. So you lift it, and you like put the words in a slightly different order, and then you have your thought. And you could never do that with George, because he was a peerless aphorist, and so you couldn't steal his stuff. And all you could do is copy it out and then type the words in front of it, quote, as George Jonas once wrote. And that's good advice. Just type out 3 or 4 of his best lines, keep it in your pocket or in a folded piece of paper, and it'll get you through almost any other public speaking engagement. And I would like to illustrate that tonight with a couple of George's lines that speak to, years after he wrote them, speak to our time. As George Jonas once wrote, if you write down your rights and freedoms, you lose them. And George was quite serious about this. He had a respect for the US Constitution. He had more of a respect for our tradition in the Westminster system, where generally speaking, we did not adumbrate every specific item of life and write it down. And he liked fellas like the British constitutionalist Dicey, who did not believe in written constitutions. And George observed that when he was a young man, when people heard something they didn't like, they would often respond, well, it's a free country, or there ought to be a law. And he observed that now you didn't hear those two sayings as much as you used to. And that the reason for that was when people used to say there ought to be a law, now there is a law. There's a law against everything. There's a law about everything. And people no longer say, well, it's a free country. And it's an odd thing because it's a cliche we all took for granted. And nobody under 50 says that. It's an odd thing. It's a way of looking at public discourse that has gone away. Some of you may remember when Ezra Levant ran into trouble with the Alberta Human Rights Commission. He was interrogated by an agent, as I think they call them. They call them Human Rights Commission agents. They're like James Bond. And Shirlene McGovern was her name. She was briefly the most famous Albertan on the planet. And she was interrogating Ezra, and Ezra went into this great sonorous rhetorical flourish about how he didn't recognize the jurisdiction of the Alberta Human Rights Commission. He had the right to say what he pleased, and he was going to continue to speak up, and he believed in free speech. And he went on a bit, as Ezra does when he gets excited. And at the end of it, Shirlene McGovern said, "Well, you're entitled to your opinion." And he said, "No, if I was entitled to my opinion, I wouldn't be here being interrogated by you." And that's the point. Sometimes what happens sneaks up on us so fast that we don't even notice that the comforting cliches have become obsolete. The most necessary condition of freedom is that the citizenry assume the habits of free people. They live like free people. They expect to be treated as free people. So when cliches disappear, when something like "you're entitled to your opinion" goes away, when "well, it's a free country" goes away, we should listen very carefully to that. Because the biggest threat here, John, it's not just culture, which is important. It's not just lawsuits. I laughed, by the way, when John said that he had, 3 lawyers and a paralegal? I wish I could get down to that slimmed down stuff. I gotta tell you, the case... Boy, I would love to get the invoice at the end of that month. That's a real bargain. That's about it. By the way, I should say, Julian Porter, who is sitting over there, Julian was our brilliant QC on the McLean's case. And I hadn't yet been tied up in a decade of American litigation by then. And the amazing thing about that case is that, Julian, you did that whole thing single-handedly. It's like, that guy over there, he's actually a lawyer who, if you hire him to do the case, he does the case. When you're south of the border, you hire the lawyer, and the lawyer, he's what they call first chair. You've heard this, Conrad. The lawyers down south of the border, they call themselves, the lead lawyer calls himself first chair, like he's with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in the violin section. And you keep thinking, well, how big is the string section going to be here? Julian is an orchestra all by himself. There's no first chair, he's the chair. And that's... another one of George's that is a famous one, I think. When you lose the habits of liberty, when you cease thinking like a free people, when you don't expect to live in freedom, something fills the void. George famously wrote, "It isn't wrong because it's illegal because it's wrong." He was talking about a period a few years ago when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were discovered to be burning the barns of Quebec separatists. And the then Prime Minister, Trudeau Père, Trudeau the Elder, I don't know, how do we refer to him now? Trudeau the Elder, Trudeau Père, he said, well, if people were so upset about the Mounties illegally burning down barns, maybe he'd make it legal to burn down barns. And George rebuked him and said, it isn't wrong because it's illegal because it's wrong. That's a fundamental view of the morality that undergirds society. And if you replace morality with law, eventually you just have legalisms, you have a bewildering array of contradictory statutes. John Moulton, Lord Moulton, who was a distinguished judge in England, and actually had what I regard, during the Great War, he had one of my favorite job titles in the British government. He was Director General of Explosives. And I don't think I think ISIS has a Director General of Explosives. I don't think actually anyone's had one since, had that job since Lord Moulton. But he used to talk about what he called divided society into three sectors, which he considered the most important to be the middle land. Because at one end you have the things that you cannot do. And that's like murder and rape and steal. And at the other end, you have the things that you are free to do, absolute freedom in. And in the middle, you have what he called the realm of manners, where you are trusted to govern yourself. And he said you judge the health of any society, of any true civilization, by how large that realm of manners between the expressly forbidden and that which you're absolutely free to do, how large that realm of manners in the middle is. And our realm of manners shrinks remorselessly. All the stories that George liked to pick out of the foot of page 37 in the newspaper, and he liked to riff off, and they recur again and again. There's a story out of Windsor, where they have a waxing salon called the Mad Wax Salon, and you can go there and get a Brazilian wax. And a couple of weeks ago, a transgender lady called up for the full Brazilian. If you don't know what a full Brazilian is, I'll give you one in the parking lot afterwards, don't worry about it. Called up for this transgender woman called up for a full Brazilian, and explained that, as is the way now, the transgender lady hadn't gone all the way, as we say. She, for Austin Powers fans, she's still at the old twig and berries, I believe the expression is. And so the guy goes, well, I think that might be a bit of a problem. The only waxologist we have on today is a devout Muslim woman. And, if the devout Muslim woman has to give you the full Brazilian, her husband's going to have to kill her. And so, of course, the aggrieved trans person says, this is an actual quote, says, what you have to accept is that you can't do this because these days women have penises, and so you have to. And so now this guy isn't like, I'm a right wing. I am an extreme right wing hate monger. So so I'm saying, I'd be saying to the transgender, bring it on, lady. I got no fear of you. This guy is just your usual Trudeaupian squish. He's like a big local guy in the Windsor business community. He's given to the LGBTQ2S. I always lose it after the second Q. He's given to the parade for years and years and years. There's no right answer to this question. There's no correct answer to this question. Do you side with the transgender person, or do you side with the Muslim waxer? In the future, there will only be news stories about wax-seeking transgenders and devout Muslim waxologists. They will be the only kind of news story that exists. There's no correct answer, but they're happy to the Ontario Human Rights Commission will be happy to destroy that guy's life over it. And that's what Lord Moulton meant by the realm of manners. I toured Australia a few years ago, and every stop along, I was very glad to have half the Australian cabinet introduce me at stops along the way, and I insisted on putting them through my rendition of Kung Fu Fighting by Carl Douglas, big disco here. Anyone know when it was #1 in Canada? Come on, we got a fully loaded Prius to give away. What? It was #1, yeah. When? What year? 74, that's right. You win the fully loaded Prius. See me afterwards. I'll be giving a Brazilian wax to the lady at the back of the room. 1974, #1. A guy it's oldies night in a pub on the Isle of Wight off the south coast of England. And a guy is singing at oldies night, Kung Fu Fighting. And an Asian man is walking outside when through the window comes the sound of a man singing, "There were funky China men in funky Chinatown." He calls the Isle of Wight police, and they arrest the oldies singer for a hate crime. Now, Kung Fu Fighting, do you know who sang Kung Fu Fighting? Wow, this is amazing. Carl Douglas. From the British West Indies, and a producer called Bidoo, who was from India, from Bangalore, where they make all those telephones. But they didn't in those days, so he had to produce disco records. And so no racist white men were involved in the production of this hate crime. But the British police arrested this guy for singing the line, "There were funky Chinamen from funky Chinatown." And that's not the hill I would choose for Western civilization to die on. I like to take the long view, 1215, Magna Carta, 803 years on, and that's great. But, 759 years after Magna Carta, this guy wrote Kung Fu Fighting, and it was completely, perfectly unexceptional until, in our view of the world, we decided it was some kind of hate crime. And that's what we have lost. People talk about sensitivity training. Have any of you had to undergo sensitivity training? Yeah, you'd rather have me give you the Brazilian wax, wouldn't you? They're doing it at Starbucks because two guys walked in and they were sitting around there for half an hour, and somebody said, "Well, are you planning on buying anything?" And they said, "No, we're not planning on buying anything. We have no intention of buying anything. We're just here to use the bathroom." And so they closed down Starbucks across the United States for all this sensitivity training. I have the opposite experience in Starbucks. I go in intending to buy something, and then after standing in the line for 35 minutes, I think, to hell with this, and go to the diner across the street where you can get a bottomless cup of coffee and endless refills for a nickel. So I've got the completely different view of Starbucks. But the point here, the sensitivity training, is we're oversensitive. If you take offense at "there were funky Chinamen from funky Chinatown," we actually do not need sensitivity training. We need insensitivity training. That is the essential ingredient to recover the ability to live as free people. Law corrodes morality. The more laws you have, the more the law itself falls into disrepute. The more the law itself just becomes a form of totalitarian control, in which the state, as it is increasingly doing in Windsor wax clinics and all over the map, is mediating what are essentially social relations, where the state tells itself that it is the sole legitimate arbiter of relations between competing identity groups. And that is why identity group activism is also at odds with citizenship. It's not something, the most famous stories about citizenship about identity come not from whether you belong to this group or whether you belong to that group, but on whether you're a citizen equal before the law. And the disgraceful thing, the absolutely disgraceful thing about this Supreme Court judgment is that says that concept is dead in Canada now. We will treat groups differently according to whether they're in fashion or not, because it doesn't boil down to anything more than that. The thing that they found so objectionable at Trinity Western was that you're supposed to be chaste before marriage. I don't know why the Dominion of Canada presumes to have an opinion on whether a private institution can be chaste or not chaste before marriage. It's simply no business of the government of Canada. As George Jonas once wrote, "Sometimes I think we won the Cold War only to show those Russians we can build a better police state." George is absolutely right about this. The old school of totalitarianism, Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union, that's George Orwell totalitarianism, a boot stamping on a human face forever. We have gone in for a more beguiling, softer totalitarianism, Aldous Huxley, Brave New World totalitarianism, a seductive, beguiling totalitarianism, where as long as we're allowed our little amusements, the chipping away of liberty around the edges isn't noticed. George was a serious man, as you heard in those brief clips there. He made light about it. But he knew what the 3 o'clock knock on the door was. He didn't forget it. He hadn't forgotten it. And until the last breath he breathed in this free land, he had a memory deep within him of what it means to live in places that are not free. And we assume that the present condition, we assume the permanence of the present tense and cannot imagine, we cannot imagine what George knew, what were his earliest memories. He said that line about the Cold War in reference to snitches, which used to be, I mentioned that I'd made this film in Budapest about operetta. It was with the BBC and Hungarian television. And we spent the first few days in Budapest meeting with our local contacts, the producers, the fixers, the interviewees, and they were all like George. I mean, Hungarians are the most urbane and civilized people on the face of the earth. They're witty, they're amusing, they're charming, they're delightful company. And so you'd be meeting with Georgi, and you'd then go on to the next meeting, at which Jccf would assure you that while Georgi may seem urbane and charming, he'd spent the previous 20 years as an informant for the Ministry of the Interior. And then you'd move on to your appointment with Gabor, and we'd be told that it was the eminently civilized and amusing Jccf, who'd been in the state informer for the past several decades. And needless to say, Victor had much the same to say about Gabor, and Imre had to say about Victor. And that snitch culture was deeply embedded in every aspect of life east of the Iron Curtain. And the BBC guys I was with found this most disquieting. Now, you know the BBC. Well, if you don't know the BBC, you know the CBC here, ABC in Australia. They're all the same. They're all this bunch of, like, university Trotskyites and Marxists. So they agreed with these guys on the politics. They had no problem with any of the communism or any of that, but they didn't like the snitching. Then the BBC crew were very discombobulated by the snitching because they felt it wasn't cricket, which is like how the British think of themselves. Not true in my view. I mean, in my view, the United Kingdom is full of duplicitous weasels who'll screw you over at every opportunity. I'm talking about the Daily Telegraph. Glad it's in the Daily Telegraph accounts department, Conrad, by the way, if you're wondering why I always insisted on dealing with you when the check had mysteriously vaporized somewhere over the Atlantic. Where was I? I got all distracted now. They didn't like the snitching. They didn't like the snitching. And you know something? It's deeply unsettling to me that we now live in an age of snitching. And I'm staggered by the number of people whose lives are ruined. David Booker was suspended from his job at a hostel for the homeless in Southampton after a late-night chat with a colleague, Fiona Vardy, in which he happened to reveal that he did not believe in same-sex marriage or in vicars being allowed to wed their gay partners. Miss Vardy raised no objection at the time, but the following day mentioned the conversation to her superiors. They immediately suspended Mr. Booker from his job and then announced that, quote, this action has been taken to safeguard both residents and staff. So this guy's out of work because he happened to say that he... Now, oddly enough, this hostel is run by the Society of St. James, which comes under the Church of England, which in theory holds exactly the same views on homosexual marriage as Mr. Booker does. But nevertheless, it was felt to be action had to be taken to safeguard both residents and staff. This is totalitarian thinking. And this snitching leads directly to that Supreme Court decision where somebody who has graduated from a school where you're supposed to be chaste before marriage is not allowed to become a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada. Wait a minute, they've changed the... Is that right, Julian? They've changed the name now. It's not the Law Society of Ontario. Yeah, it's the Law Society bit they should have changed because they're not that anymore. This is totalitarianism. And the snitching we see, again, Twitter exists, for example, only to destroy careers. There's no point. It's to destroy celebrity careers. I mean, it was great that Roseanne lost her show, but it would have been much better if we could have driven her to suicide, right? Because that would have been terrific. A lady made a joke about catching AIDS in Africa as she was getting on the plane at JFK in New York. And by the time she got off the plane in Johannesburg, she'd been fired from her job. Her entire world had collapsed. Sir Tim Hunt, FRS PhD, he's got post-nominals coming out of his butt. He's one of the most eminent men on the planet. He's at a conference somewhere in Asia, and he makes a joke about sometimes when you have girls in the laboratory, it can all get a bit difficult because they cry and this kind. He's one of the most distinguished scientists in his field. He gets on the plane. By the time he lands at Heathrow, his career is over. We are developing Eastern European habits, destroying our neighbors, consciously looking for the telltale remark that will vaporize them. And people should stand up. There was a great moment the other day, the head of Twitter, which is a completely pointless thing, Twitter. Got no use for Twitter at all. I've got a Twitter account. How many followers do you have, Andrew? I don't know how many I got, but here Andrew actually tweets. I tweeted once, and then my minders took away the keys and changed the password, so I couldn't do it again. And they're very wise. And so I have no idea who tweets for me now, actually. And I don't want to know. But the chairman of Twitter, he made the mistake of going to Chick-fil-A. Have you ever been to that? It's like this homophobic chicken sandwich. It's like, juicy. I love the taste of homophobic chicken. It's great. That's like, you talk about Colonel Sanders. He had fried chicken, but homophobic chicken. he went to Chick-fil-A and said he'd had a great sandwich and he'd gotten 30 cents off or whatever. Immediately, all these people, how dare you eat at Chick-fil-A? The guy at Twitter who drives people to kill themselves, he was coming under the Twitter storm. It couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. That's the monster he invented. That's the bit in the Frankenstein movie when the monster suddenly starts having a go at the Baron. In this case, finally, we are losing the ability to function as free people with a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. Another George Jonas line I always like. What matters in any population is not the numbers, but who makes the running, who has the energy, who has the wind at their backs. And again, that's what the Supreme Court did today. They're telling you about the hierarchy of identity groups. Yeah. I love stories like the transgender wax customer and the Muslim waxologist, because they oblige these fool jurists actually to start articulating a hierarchy of groups. Now, I happen to think Islam is the most belligerent, although some of these transgender activists can run them a very close second. But we've seen how it goes. You know the big fuss about the book in the British Columbia school system, Heather has two mommies, and all the Christians were told, hey, just got to suck it up and take it. Life has moved on. Heather has two mommies, we're going to teach it to your kid, we're going to ram it down your kid's throat, get used to it. They tried to teach the same book to a group of grade schoolers in Bristol, England, which happened to have a majority Muslim school population, and say what you like about those imams, but they got that book chased out of there in nothing flat. So it's about hierarchy of victim groups, and if it's a choice between Heather has two mommies and Heather has two imams and a big bearded daddy who wants to marry her off to a cousin in Pakistan, bet on the latter every time. A hierarchy of victims groups. I don't know how much further we can go at this, because eventually if you're not careful, you can wind up at the point you started from. At Wellesley College in Massachusetts, a girl student who identifies as a, quote, masculine of center genderqueer. Any masculine of center genderqueers in the house here? Yeah, you at the back with the faint 5 o'clock shadow. A masculine of center genderqueer named Timothy, and prefers to be referred to by male pronouns, was told that she could no longer run for coordinator of the School Office of Multicultural Affairs because she was now a white male and therefore insufficiently diverse to be a diversity officer. Which is tough on a masculine of centre genderqueer. She diversified a wee bit too far and diversified herself all the way around and right out of the diversity business and back into the white man business, which is where you don't want to be. It's not about numbers. It's about who makes the noise. Who makes the noise? And that's the relevance of the Jordan Peterson business. They don't care whether you believe. When they want you to say Z and Z and all that kind of stuff, they don't care whether you believe. Believe what you want. Think you're doing a Maurice Chevalier impression. Every little bit, but it's in the whisper Louise. Or a Chrétien impression. Every time John Howard, the Australian Prime Minister, he does a great Chrétien impression, but about 2 minutes in, it veers into Maurice Chevalier. But do as you want. Every little boy seems to... They don't care whether you believe. They just want you, again, it's a totalitarian thing. They want to force you to live the lie. And in actual fact, the point about the Z and Z business is that if you don't believe it, but they make you feel you have to believe it, You've got no choice but to shut up and say it. That is a great victory. And again, that is totalitarianism. That is the way they did it in the Soviet Union. They didn't care when they took you to the re-education camp. You could come out just pretending to be all glassy-eyed and monotone-voiced. They don't matter. It's making you live the lie. George said a great thing about terrorism a couple of years ago. The point about terrorism is it's not about hijacking airliners. It's about hijacking the debate. It's about hijacking the conversation. And that's how successful terrorism works. It wants to terrorize you into avoiding certain subjects. And we have seen that to an extraordinary length in the last 10, 15 years. I always do the anniversary commemorations in the Danish Parliament of the Danish Mohammed cartoons. And one reason they ask me is because I'm like the only guy who isn't dead yet, which is, you know, nice for me, but I worry as I'm getting nearer and nearer the top of the bill that at some point that logic is better. The first one I did was 5 years, the 5th anniversary. I was on stage with Lars Hedegaard, who got shot at point-blank range by a Muslim terrorist, fortunately an incompetent one, but one who fled to Turkey, and Mr. Erdogan is declining to extradite him. I was with Shabana Rahman, who's a Norwegian comedian whose family restaurant was firebombed. I was with Lars Vilks, a Swedish artist who had his event shot up. And 2 people died in the terror attacks at that. I was with the Dutch cartoonist Neckshot, who's given up cartooning and has been forced into hiding. That's basically that's a 80% hit rate from those of us who were on stage in the year 2010. And that's sobering. But what I find even more disturbing is people's reaction to that is to actually say, okay, we'll close that off. We're not going to go there. We're not going to do cartoons in that area. Because it's reasonable not to want to be shot, not to want to have your family restaurant firebombed. That's a reasonable thing. And then it goes further up. I'm sure Doug has been in meetings where people have been pitching, you know, certain, it's a novel about a young girl living in a Muslim ghetto in Molenbeek in Brussels, and she's being made to marry her cousin, and she's only 14, she doesn't want to marry her cousin, and she'd like to go off and maybe go to the Netherlands and meet interesting young Dutchmen. And the publisher said, well, that is interesting. Couldn't we make it like she's a 14-year-old girl living in Alabama, and her parents are like redneck Christian fundamentalists, and they want, they're Trump voters, and she wants to run away and have an affair with Bernie Sanders. It wouldn't be a lot of changes, you know, it'd be just... And those are the books we will never read, they're the plays we will never see, they are the movies that will never be made, they are the art exhibitions that are already being cancelled. When I made a big deal about the Danish Mohammed cartoons, people said, what are you talking about? Denmark, who cares about Denmark? It's some rinky-dink little country up near the Arctic Circle. And I said, well, I'm Canadian. We're a rinky-dink little country up near the Arctic Circle. What's your point? What was interesting is that these pictures start in Denmark. The rest of the world, apart from Charlie Hebdo, and we know how they ended up, aren't willing to stand with the artists who drew those cartoons. And so eventually, Yale University Press in New Haven, Connecticut, decides to publish a book on the Danish Mohammed cartoons in which they say, the argument of the book is basically, this is all a big fuss, nothing to see here, don't worry about it, none at all. At the very last minute, they decide they will not show the Muhammad cartoons in that book or any other ancient artistic representation of Muhammad. And so this little thing, it starts up in the rinky-dink little country up near the Arctic Circle, Denmark, Canada, where the hell it is, and it's next thing you know, it's one of the two most prestigious institutions in the United States is too scared and too cowed to report on a controversy and actually show its readers what the controversy is about. And that is the world we're moving in. George, another line of his, after the Ann Coulter speech was shut down, and I think that was that was my friend Andrew's event in Canada. Actually, I should correct, he was introduced as if he were my valet, Andrew Lawton. In fact, is anyone here from London, Ontario? Because Andrew was your, that explains the result. Andrew was a candidate in that election, and it wasn't say until yeah, give him a round of applause. This is his first line. It's safe to be seen with me again. They were all saying, well, you can't, Andrew Lawton, Doug Ford really needs to distance himself from Andrew Lawton because he was photographed with Mark Steyn in the lobby of the King Edward Hotel in 1993. So that's what it takes to get you, bounced. But Andrew brought Ann Coulter to Canada. And again, a sign of a free society, Francois Houle, the provost of the University of Ottawa, he warned Ann Coulter that she was in Canada now, so to be careful what she said. Again, this is extraordinary. She hasn't opened her mouth, and she's already being warned by a university that she should think carefully before she says anything. Then, of course, a mob shows up, and the Ottawa police, as George Jonas observed, said Ottawa basically got the event cancelled by declining to police it. Ottawa's finest exemplified Canada's definition of moral leadership by observing neutrality between lawful and lawless. And there's more and more of that now too. Security is the new shut up. We don't actually censor you. But we say to you that in order to ensure that everybody has a safe experience, we're going to need you to put down $100,000 in a security deposit. And then when you go to the trouble of flying in and turning up to give the speech, there's going to be a mob, and the police will stand idly by while the mob shuts down your event. So again, the inability to function as free people. Eventually, you lose the capacity to argue. You lose the capacity to debate. And so in the end, all you can do is smash and smash and smash, while the police stand by because it happens to suit their interests that you not be allowed to speak. George saw all this. He saw this coming. He wasn't like a lot of people who thought that the Human Rights Commissions in the 60s were some kind of nice, fluffy Easter Bunny idea that just like bounced around and was nice to it. He saw it as a great evil because he understood that these things start on the fringes of the map and work in. I thought George Jonas was the very greatest of my colleagues at the National Post. He was a tremendous writer, a gifted writer, a brilliant writer. I've spoken before, I think, at his memorial of how I regretted that he was comparatively ungarlanded by the Canadian state. He was given the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, which Mr. Harper handed out somewhat promiscuously for my taste. In fact, Faisal Joseph, who was the lawyer who took us to all those human rights tribunals in Ottawa and in Vancouver, he got the Diamond Jubilee Medal. Did you get the Diamond Jubilee Medal? I did. You did. I don't care, you, Dr. White. Look, I was a monarchist until I heard that Julian didn't get the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal. Okay, so what's the next one she's up for?
Well, she just had the sapphire.
And did you get him a sapphire?
There wasn't one.
Well, keep working on it. She's gonna overtake Franz Josef, according to Conrad, in like 6 months' time. And if she has I pipped Franz Josef Jubilee Medal, I want to make sure that Julian gets one. Okay? Faisal Joseph got one for trying to shut down free speech in Canada. Free speech in Canada. Julian actually made he in the British Columbia court. I was in Vancouver, and he warned me that under British Columbia trial rules, if you walk in the court, Faisal Joseph can turn round and summon you to the witness stand immediately. And I said, well, what's the problem with that? And Julian said cautiously, well, you're a somewhat mercurial personality. And Julian, on that last day, he said in court about the old line, which is a terrible false line, that you've no right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theatre, which is some stupid line from the days when Broadway theatres were gaslit. And Julian said, you do not only have a right to shout fire in a crowded theatre, but when the theatre is on fire, you have a duty to shout fire. And that is the situation we are in with our core liberties today. The theatre is on fire, and we are pretending not to notice it. As I said, I thought George was ungarlanded, and Julian's wife, Anna Porter, whom you all know, Anna got George inducted into the Order of Canada as a member of the Order of Canada, and I always say this because I feel it when I look at the number of totally third-rate writers and phony intellectuals who are there at the higher ranks, an officer of the Order of Canada and a commander of the Order of Canada. I find it hard to contain my disgust. I think George should have held out for a dukedom rather than that. And yet Anna had to work hard to get that to him. I would like to end with two of my favorite poems by George, written half a century apart, actually. This one is called Greenwich Village. And you'll recognize, if you saw some of those photographs of George in his bohemian, raffish days, you'll recognize this world. The girl who shares this upstairs room with a cat, a guitar, and a Chesterfield left her native town, Sarnia, because it was the end of the world. First, she moved on to Montreal, then crossed the ocean to Prague, quickly returned to Los Angeles, and now she's bitterly crying. She's bitterly crying, I suppose, because she'd seen much sea and land without once having glimpsed that world of which Sarnia is the end. And that's George's poem. Anyone here from Sarnia tonight, by the way? And in a sense, that's clever stuff. That's wordplay. Something a witty man, alert to the cliches. He hears the false tinkle and he makes something of it. But it's also profound, because in a sense, we do look, when we come to this or that town, as if it's the end of the world. And we don't actually think about that world of which Sarnia is the end. So the phrase has stuck with me all the years since I first read it. Then the last one I want to read of his is a poem on Ibn Amr al-Andalusi, the Portuguese Muslim poet and sometime Grand Vizier of Seville. Any Grand Viziers in the house tonight? No. Grand Vizier of Sarnia? No sign. He lived pretty much exactly 1,000 years ago, and this is a meditation on decline. 1 minute you're the world, and the next you're on a one-way ticket to Sarnia or beyond. And that's hard to see. It's very hard to see when the surface prosperity is still around and everything's still working and still functioning. For us, as it was for Ibn Ammar a millennium ago. George's poem concludes, "He was cheerful and happier than I, for when on Spanish domes the arabesque loosened and fell, he never questioned why or why people grew flabby and grotesque, and did not sense the fabric's fading dye, or in his own tunic the broken thread, the fountains of the city running dry. He did not taste the filth inside his bread, or see the boys who knew his poems die, or view the burning library with dread. Brave and clever, he failed to note the fact that faith's no help, nor wit courage, nor dagger, that no philosophy will resurrect a culture. Collapsing is forever." And we too cannot sense the fabric's fading dye, and we do not understand that collapsing is forever. So do as George did, speak up about it. The most necessary thing is not to wait for dinners like this, not to wait for speakers like George, but to live like George did on these issues every day of your life. He was a poet. He was a librettist. He worked at the CBC. Do you think any of them were interested in the ideas he had about Western civilization and our loss of freedoms? No. But he lived in truth every day of his life. And that is what all of you have to do too. And that way you can avoid the next Danish Mohammed cartoons, or the next guys to be gunned down at Charlie Hebdo, or the next person on Twitter to lose her job because she made some silly joke on the way to her South African vacation. Don't let that happen, and don't let everybody be picked off one by one and bullied and surrendered into silence. Live as free people, and don't let the hate speech enforcers, they're cowards. I learned that. It's not fun, it's tiring, but if you push back, they crumble. It's indefensible what they're doing. That if you push back against it, don't meet them halfway. Don't do Tanya Granick Allen is somewhere in the house, and I'll tell you something about that. I don't want to live in a world where someone can make one remark at a speech and boom, she's vaporized. And everyone's pleased about that and thinks it's just. It's not just. The cure is worse than the disease. The cure is worse than the disease. So don't play games with the hate speech enforcers or the Islamic enforcers. That's the good cop, bad cop routine of totalitarianism. Don't let them tell you that you are not free. You are free. And demand of everyone, particularly people who purport to be leading a so-called conservative party in an advanced Western democracy, that you do not surrender on core issues of free speech. Share the risk. Speak up, speak out, live in truth, and if that is all too much for you, relax, unwind, get a plane like George Jonas did, and write some translation of Rilke while you're flying up there among the clouds. Live the life, but live in truth. Thank you very much indeed.